When all seems left to chance, it is all in God's hands. Church, who's in control when calamity strikes? Who's at work in the ordinary events of daily life? When you feel insignificant, is there something more that's going on? Have you ever looked at your calamity and realized that there was more happening behind the scenes than you had noticed at first? Haven't the ordinary events of daily life in some way morphed into a path that you could have never imagined on your own? And in those times of feeling small and unheard, hasn't there been a glimpse, even if just a small one, a glimpse of something remarkable at play? And now, even though many things in our lives feel like happenstance, like the luck of the draw, deep down you know that they did not occur by chance. And so I wonder, what are the chances that your story is a part of the greatest story ever told? Now, this was certainly true for Naomi and Ruth. We had two widows here, one a mother-in-law and the other a daughter-in-law. And both play a significant role in the greatest story of the world. And yet their role doesn't look very flashy, does it? It's not filled with gold and glitz and glamour. In fact, a lot of it feels horrific at worst and just plain ordinary at best. I don't think they had any idea of the role that they played in the greatest story, but it can't be denied. Last week, chapter 1 concluded with a devastated Naomi. Her whole life seemed bitter. A famine had just occurred in Bethlehem, and so her husband and her sons relocated to the land of Moab. And it was in this foreign location, in the place of Moab, that Naomi faced what has brought her tremendous grief, because her husband, Elimelech, died, and her two sons died, which now has left Naomi without any heir to be able to carry on the family lineage. All she has now is two Moabite daughters-in-law, one who returned back to Moab, and the other, Ruth, who has chosen to stay with her until the very end. And that's where we pick up the story heading into chapter 2. Now, why Ruth for Advent again? Well, last week we pointed out a few things, that this story takes place in Bethlehem, for instance. And Bethlehem was where Jesus was born, and so there's a connection there. Secondly, Ruth shows us how we go from the time of the judges, which was a wicked and evil time, to the genealogy of David. And King David would one day have a descendant whose name is Jesus, the promised King of Kings. And so without what happens in this small little book, without what happens here to Naomi and Ruth, we don't get Christmas. But there's a third reason, and that's that Ruth is a story of anticipation, a story where we long for hope and for peace and for redemption. We yearn for a solution to Naomi's problem, and this is a theme that's fitting for us in a season where we remember the distress and the hopelessness of the world before the Savior was born. Like the Christmas hymn says, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. A thrill of hope, the weary soul rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn." In Ruth, we find a similar hopelessness. In this book, there's a need for redemption. It's a story where weakness and brokenness is front and center, but it's met with overwhelming kindness. A kindness that leads to a child being born, and this child will eventually carry on the family lineage until one day we get the famous baby in the little town of Bethlehem. Now, as we saw last week, we get to the hope of Christmas through what seems like nothing but bitterness. And this week, it all comes to pass through a seemingly chance event in the middle of a not-so-random field. We might say with the author that this was just the luck of the draw. But when we'd say that, we'd say it with a wink of the eye because we truly know that it's really all in God's hands, don't we? Now, is the writer of Ruth really showing us this? Is the writer really showing us what God does in the midst of seemingly chance events? I mean, it makes for a good sermon, but is it really here in the text? Well, let's take a look at, I think, one of the most important verses of the entire book. We'll look at verse 3, and I want you to see if you see it with me. Verse 3 says, "So she, Ruth, set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech." She just so happened to come to the most important field in the entire area. Literally, the phrase here in the original language is something along the lines of Ruth's chance chanced upon. There's redundancy. Her chance chanced upon, as luck would have it, we might say. And this is intentional and ironic language by the author to pretty much communicate the exact opposite of what it's saying. We have another use of this word of chance and coincidence in 1 Samuel chapter 6 because the Philistines talked a lot about chance and coincidence. They had this belief in chance and happenstance and fate. And so whenever they stole the Ark of the Covenant from God's people, great sufferings came upon the Philistines, and they wanted to figure out if this suffering was from God striking them or not. And so they devise a plan to try to figure it out. Did this come from God's hand or no? And this is what the Philistines say. "Take and prepare a new cart and 2 milk cows on which there has never come a yoke, and yoke the cows to the cart, but take their calves home away from them." So they're separating the cows from their calves. "And take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart, and put in a box at its side the figures of gold, which you are returning to him as a guilt offering, and then send it off and let it go its way. And watch, if it goes up on the way to its own land, to Beth Shemesh, then it is God who has done this great harm. But if not, then we shall know that it's not his hand that struck us. It happened to us by coincidence." The Philistines were in denial. They didn't want to admit that God's hand was against them, and so they rigged the system. Because cows would naturally and maternally return to their calves. And so they rig the system to make this chance scenario happen, so they didn't have to admit that God was behind all of it. Because if the cows go back to the calves like normal, then this all happened by coincidence. But if the cows ignore their maternal instincts and they go their own way and they leave their calves, then God did it. And for those who know the story, the cows do the opposite of what they would normally do. They don't return to their calves. Why? Because nothing happens by chance. It's all in God's hands. Even cows and calves and even a widow who just so happened to stumble across Boaz's field by chance. This is good news for those of us this Christmas who wonder, why me? Why do I always seem to get the short end of the stick? Why does bad luck always seem to happen to me? Why does life seem to be out of control? Like things are happening against me and nothing can be possibly done about it? Why does it feel like life is really all up in the air, that it'll either go my way or not, whatever fate decides? Well, friends, this morning I want to show you that when it all seems like chance, it is all in God's hands. When it all seems like chance, it is all in God's hands. And I want to show you this by looking at God's hand at work among the unlikely. I want us to see his hand at work in everyday routines, and we're going to see his hand at work through so-called chance events. We begin by seeing God's hand among the unlikely. And unlikely is a chance word, isn't it? It deals with odds. And the odds are certainly stacked against Naomi and Ruth. Here's verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So why are the odds stacked against Ruth? Well, she's referred to here in verse 2 as Ruth the Moabite. And she can't seem to live this title down throughout this entire book. In fact, in verse 6 of the same chapter, Boaz's servant says she's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And it's on Ruth's mind herself. In verse 10, she says to Boaz, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And then later down in verse 21, the narrator says it again. And Ruth the Moabite said. And so the book refuses to let us forget her origin. Because whatever her issue is in this book, it has to be multiplied. Because she's not originally from here. She's not from around town. And even though caring for the sojourner was commanded of Israel, this still took place during the days when the judges ruled. And the book of Judges says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So the question remains, how many people here actually care? How many people here actually care about upholding what God commanded? Instead of foreigners being taken care of, perhaps some of them would have been targeted instead. But why else? Why else are the odds stacked against Ruth? Well, she's also a widow. Neither she nor Naomi have a husband. So she's hurting, she's broken, and she's poor. That's why she's going to go glean in the field. During this time, farmers were prevented from harvesting around the perimeter of the field. If they dropped any of the harvest along the way, they actually weren't supposed to go back and collect whatever they dropped. Instead, it was supposed to be left for others to come and glean. So that if you were a foreigner, or if you were poor, or if you were a widow, you could come to the field and you could glean from whatever was left behind. It truly was a compassionate law, because it not only ensured that the poor could have their needs met, but it also required them to go and work for it and to glean from the fields. And so while Ruth has the opportunity here to glean, the fact that she's forced to glean reminds us of her situation. She's a foreigner, she's a widow, and she's poor. There's nothing exciting about what she's set out to do. Lastly, we see her lack of odds when she says, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." It seems up in the air, doesn't it? Her hope is that someone would let her glean. Perhaps someone would treat her kindly, but it's not guaranteed. She wants to find the one who would see her and have favor upon her, which means there might be many who don't have favor upon her. In verse 9, we get a little bit of a hint of what could happen. Here's what Boaz said to Naomi. He said, "Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you?" Remember, once again, we're dealing with the time of the Judges, a book that records even a horrific act performed on a vulnerable woman. And so, yes, there's this law. Yes, Ruth has a right to go and glean. She's a foreigner, she's poor, she's a widow. There are multiple reasons for her to be able to be there. And yet she left for the day simply hoping to find someone who would look upon her with favor. And this is a concern for her, most likely because it was not set in stone. Someone might reject her. Someone might take advantage of her in her vulnerable state. The odds are not stacked in the favor of Ruth. Well, church, praise God that God is not a God of odds. I love that Ruth didn't allow the odds to keep her frozen and stagnant. I mean, her situation was obvious. If people were placing bets, no one would have rightly put their money on Ruth, of all people. But it didn't matter, did it? Because the odds or the chances or fate are not entities that have control over anything. God is in control over everything. And church, if we aren't careful, we'll live this life as though what happens to us is subject to whatever the odds are. And so we begin putting our trust in likelihood and percentages. Next month will either be really bad because it always is, or next month will be really good because last year it was. I mean, yes, Naomi knows she's a foreigner. So she's amazed when someone shows favor to her, as though it was pretty unlikely to happen. But she left the house that morning looking to glean from someone who would show favor to her, as though it was likely to happen. And I think that we can learn much from Naomi here, that her hope didn't end where the odds were unfavorable, because I think she knew she had a God in heaven who superseded the odds makers and what they put down in the books. I can't tell you how many times I was so dead sure something would happen because of how likely it would be, and it didn't. Or how many times I was so sure that something wouldn't happen, and it did. She says, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." Now, to be fair, what Naomi says there is not explicitly stated as a prayer, but God does hear her desire, doesn't he? And he answers it. And I think this can help teach us to pray. Because the more and more that I trust in the odds of something happening based on me and my performance and my ability, the less likely I am to pray about it. It's either going to happen because I think I got this, or it's not going to happen because it never does. Regardless, why go to the Lord in prayer when I've already calculated the answer in my mind? If only we could live with God on the forefront of our minds instead of whatever we think the odds are. He takes the most unlikely and he does the most remarkable, because our God is not a God of odds. He takes a poor foreigner widow and brings her into the very lineage of Jesus. So what can he not do in your unlikely situation? God's hand is at work among the unlikely. We also see God's hand in everyday routines. I love how we're introduced to Boaz in verse 4. "Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.'" And we can learn something about this little interaction between the boss man and his servants. That God should be brought into our everyday routines because God is in our everyday routines. So let me ask you, how much of your daily routine do you think is by chance or by God's design? The toddler who knees you in the ribs at 6:30 in the morning to wake you up. Is it by chance or by design? The interaction that you have with your husband before he goes off to work, whether it's good or bad, is it by chance or is it by design? Or how about the first coworker you might see when you step into the office tomorrow? Is it by chance or by design? Perhaps a customer or a client or a patient blows up on you for no reason. Did this happen by chance or by design? Or you might hit traffic one day. Did you just get unlucky whenever you ran into traffic? Or was it by God's hand? A package might show up late. A church member invites you to lunch. A text message comes in with exciting news, followed by a phone call with bad news. Are these things simply happenstance? Did they come across your plate today for no apparent reason, or did it all occur by God's design? You see, so much of our daily routine seems like chance events because we fail to keep God on the forefront of our minds. This was not the case with Boaz and his servants. Boaz brought God into his everyday life. And of course, God was always there, but Boaz made a conscious effort to remember him. So he greets his workers, he greets his servants, and he says, "The Lord be with you." And they respond, "The Lord bless you." And this is not just some filler language. This is how a group of righteous men spoke on a regular basis during a morally chaotic and wicked season of Israel's history. They took whatever they were doing in their daily routine and they merged it in with their faith. Just imagine how strange it might be walking into your landlord's office to give him a check, and the first thing he says is, "The Lord be with you." Or seeing your neighbor hang lights on his house and shouting from across the street when you get out of the car, "God be with you today." We would think it's strange because it's not normal. The truth is, while God's hand is at work in the everyday routines of our lives, our minds are not always set on Him in our everyday routines. And so we perceive that most of what happens to us is just happening instead of coming from God Himself. I wonder how the knee jabbing you at 6:30 a.m. would feel if you knew it came by God's design and not by chance. Or how you would handle the conversation with your husband, or how you would greet your coworker if you knew those interactions came by God's design and not by chance. How would the everyday routines of your life be improved by a recognition of God's presence and God's work in the midst of all of them? God's hand is at work in the unlikely. His hand is at work in everyday routines. And lastly, His hand is at work in so-called chance events. Verse 3 again, "So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech." Ruth's chanced upon. She just so happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. And this is a seemingly chance encounter. But we find out that it was no chance encounter at all. Now, there's two specific details here that show that God's hand is ultimately at work in all of these situations. The first is that Ruth finds favor. She finds favor in the sight of Boaz when perhaps she might not have found any favor all day. She set out in hopes of finding favor, that someone would look upon her and be kind to her, and she's now found that person. And so when Boaz arrives on the scene and he notices this young woman gleaning in the fields, he has a conversation with his servants first. Starting in verse 5, Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' And so she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Boaz had no idea who this woman was. He doesn't even ask for her name, doesn't even receive her name. But he finds out something beautiful about her. That this was the same woman who came back with Naomi. She's the one that the whole town of Bethlehem had been talking about, and the kindness that she displays in her life. And here she is now working hard all day to provide for her mother-in-law. And so Boaz turns and addresses Ruth in verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." And just look at the kindness of Boaz here. Not only does he let her glean in the field, he wants her to stay in the field. She doesn't have to worry about running off somewhere else. He's not worried about losing any more crops. He's inviting her to come and partake. But then he goes even more above and beyond. According to the law, he He had to allow Ruth to be able to glean in the field, but he didn't have to go the extra mile to make sure she knew that she was going to be safe among him. He tells her that he commanded all the young men in the field not to touch her. And then he says that she could drink of the vessels that the men had drawn. And these vessels are primarily for these reapers who are out in the field sweating all day. It's where they go to grab water to be able to refresh. And Boaz says, not only can you take from the crops, but you can also have the water. How does Ruth respond in verse 10? She fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And this is where we see the Lord's hand now clearly at work. Because she started the day with a desire to find favor in somebody's eyes, and now she has. And so she asks him, why has she found favor in his eyes? And I love Boaz's response here. He takes time now to speak kindly to her. Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz knows that God rewards those who seek him in truth. This is such a wonderful part of the story, because in the first place, all of Ruth's loving and righteous deeds have been humble. When nobody else was watching, she could have gone back to Moab and treated herself. She was young and she was able. She could have easily found another husband back in her home country, but instead she chooses her mother-in-law and her needs above herself. Well, Boaz has taken notice. And in Boaz taking notice, it's ultimately the Lord who has seen Ruth. None of her righteous deeds in private have gone unseen. And Boaz takes the time to tell her. You know, all of chapter 1 was exceedingly bitter. Chapter 2 feels like a chance event, like the luck of the draw. But in it, God's hand has been at work the whole way, because there is now a man who's willing to provide, and he speaks kindly to this broken woman. I mean, who knows the last time anyone said something kind to her? But Ruth responds in verse 13. She said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." The kindness continues in verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." And so she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean, even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." He's going above and beyond. It all seemed like chance, didn't it, in verse 3? When she stumbled upon a random field, and we find out it was owned by a man who would look upon her with favor and provide. She found favor. That's how we know God's hand is at work in this. But we find out one more truth that makes this so-called chance trip to the field not so random after all. Because Ruth not only found favor, but she found a redeemer. Starting in verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. And then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over from being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And so Boaz is not just kind. He's not just a worthy man. He's not just the owner of this large field who's able to provide for all of Ruth's needs. He's a close relative to Naomi through her deceased husband Elimelech. He's a kinsman redeemer. You know, according to Leviticus 25, if a man died during this time without leaving a son behind, a close relative was to marry his wife and then redeem the land and provide a son to carry out the deceased man's name. And it just so happens that Ruth happened upon a field owned by a man who could legally be this redeemer. Imagine for a moment the things that had to take place in this so-called chance event. Ruth just so happened to come across Boaz's field. She just so happened to be granted permission by the servants to go and glean. She just so happened to find favor in Boaz's eyes. And she just so happened to find out that Boaz could legally be the family's kinsman redeemer. She could have gone potentially to a different field and there would be no hope. She could have been turned away by the servants and never met Boaz, and there would be no hope. She could have found a kind man, a man who would let her glean, a man who would be generous, but who wasn't a redeemer and couldn't offer the hope that her family needed. Or she could have come upon a redeemer who could offer the hope the family needed, but he would be a harsh and hateful man who had no interest in helping. Yet all these things came to pass on the same day because it was all left to chance? No, because it was all in God's hands. Friends, you don't just happen upon anything by chance. God has your entire life planned out. I love Naomi's response to all of this good news of God's hand at work. She says in verse 20, "May he be blessed by the Lord," and then talking about the Lord, "whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." I mean, what a change from chapter 1. In chapter 1, she was convinced that God was against her in some way. And she inaccurately perceived that she had left full and had returned empty. But now she recognizes the Lord's kindness has not forsaken her. And I'm not sure what circumstances are surrounding you this morning, but I know that God has your entire life in His hands. And perhaps He has you here specifically this morning to be reminded that He has not forsaken you. When we just take a moment to truly think about it, when we begin to see that God's hand is at work in all things, we realize we didn't really plan out our lives, did we? God did. Every trial, every job, every friendship, every opportunity given by Him, even when it seemed like chance. So just consider, friends, how we get from the wicked days of the judges to a baby that would one day be born in a manger in Bethlehem. It didn't always seem like some plan that human beings had in mind that they could carry out to completion. It didn't always seem like some to-do list written down and meticulously followed. It sometimes looked like a so-called chance encounter in a random field. But that's because God wants us to see that His hand is at work even there. So then how can this reality be yours this morning? How can you know that when it all seems like chance, it is all God's hands and that He is working all things for your good according to His purpose? How can you be sure that He's using His hands in your life to bring you good all the days of your life? Well, this kinsman redeemer named Boaz points to a future redeemer, one by the name of Jesus, whom we remember as being born in Bethlehem. And this Redeemer, Jesus, redeems us not from some calamity in our family history, but from our sin. much of what happened to Jesus could have looked like chance, like being betrayed by a friend, or being arrested and flogged, or having a crowd scream for Barabbas instead of Jesus. Who would have done that? Having him crucified between these two robbers, and yet all of it was in God's hands, because the plan was for him to go to the cross, not to pay the debt of our land like a kinsman redeemer, but to pay our debt by dying on the cross so that we do not have to. And so have you found favor from the ultimate Redeemer? You don't do it by your own strength. You don't do it by your own merit. You do what Boaz said about Ruth. You take refuge under his wings. Some people take refuge under money, or under careers, or under family, or under some escape to get away from the cares of the world. Some take refuge by running away. Some take refuge in circumstances. Some take refuge in their own abilities and their goodness. But that's not how we find favor. Instead, we find favor from God by coming broken and hopeless like Ruth, by coming needy and desperate, and we find our only hope under the wings of Jesus. So we've come now to the end of chapter 2. Verse 23 says, "So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law." Naomi no longer seems bitter. In fact, the bitterness is completely gone. This time we have a happy Naomi and a happy Ruth. They're amazed and they're startled at all that has transpired. They've gone from being widowed and extremely poor to having all these so-called chance events line up perfectly to bring this potential kinsman redeemer on the scene. Because when it all seems like chance, it is all in God's hands. But what will happen when things seem uncertain? Next week, we'll get a chance to see God's hand at work, even in the midst of uncertainty. But for now, let's pray to our sovereign God.